Hi, everyone. This is Chrissie Ferguson with the Wishlist Foundation. And to celebrate Earth Day 2021, we're going to bring your attention to SeaLegacy, an organization that uses the power of media and storytelling to amplify ocean solutions. As many of you know, SeaLegacy was brought to our attention as Pearl Jam fans when Paul Nicklin's phenomenal photography was featured on the album cover of Gigaton. Paul founded SeaLegacy alongside co-founders Christina Mittermeier and Shawn Heinrichs. And today I will not only discuss the great work of SeaLegacy and its team, but as part of the artist series, I have the opportunity to feature the incredibly talented artist, photographer, conservationist, and Emmy award-winning cinematographer Shawn Heinrichs as part of the artist series. So welcome, Shawn, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So if you could tell us a little bit about SeaLegacy's mission. It seems in looking at social media that the main goal is to educate others as your team continues to take photos and tell stories that will hopefully move people into action. So is SeaLegacy's primary focus on connecting with others through social media?
I think let's get down to what we're really focused on, which is the results, right? And the outcome, the end product that we're targeting is healthy and abundant oceans that not only serve nature and keep entire ecosystems intact, but in the long term actually serve humanity, mankind, all of us in ways that we can't even imagine. Every second breath we take comes from the oceans. Over 2 billion people depend on the oceans for their primary source of protein. 500 million people have their primary income working in and on the oceans. Billions of people live on coastal communities that rely on reefs and all kinds of stuff to keep their shorelines intact so that their homes don't wash away. So really, our mission is to ensure that using our platforms, using our storytelling, our art, communications, convening, and outreach and strategy, bringing people together to try to create a global movement where everybody starts to take note of their individual actions and how that's impacting the oceans, but also starting to understand how the oceans are serving them. And so that we create a really deep connection so that people start to change their behaviors in support of healthy oceans.
And so when we are looking, if we're looking at Instagram to see what stories you're working on or where you all are traveling as storytellers and photographers to bring our attention to these matters, you just aren't focusing on things that matter just to you or creating facts that you actually have an expert counsel. Is that correct?
We have been in this work for, I think, combined between our team members, almost 100 years. Maybe that dates us a bit. But individually, like, for example, I've been doing this work for over 20 years. And one of the beautiful things about working on the front lines around the world, and that's from South America, Central America, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, into the Atlantic and the Caribbean, is you develop a really comprehensive, close network. And we've been incredibly fortunate because we're a highly collaborative organization and all the founders and team members take that role seriously. So we have a network of scientists, policymakers, cultural experts, community leaders, business operators, you name it, that we call upon to help guide our actions. Because, it's sort of a silly metaphor, but there's an ocean of issues that we could work on, right? And there's a finite amount of us and there's a finite amount of time. So what we're doing is doing our best to really focus on the issues, the here and now most pressing issues that are affecting our oceans today and ones that we can take action on. And that's really important because it's all good to sort of complain about climate change, right? But the real question is, what can I do about it? What can you do about it? And us as an organization, how can we foster change and foster people to become activists in protecting the environment? So we're really focused on issues that we're experts in, ones where we can make an impact, where we can build community around it, and we can move the needle.
And I think that leads to my next question. So this is so overwhelming for so many people, and they read it, and yes, this is a problem and we need to take care of our oceans, but what can we do, especially for people who maybe aren't really thinking about it? What are some baby steps or some things we can do to help the ocean?
Well, I get that question a lot from people, is like, why does it matter what I do, right? Well, every single day we are making individual decisions that impact the oceans. And it starts first and foremost with what we consume. Your diet, the things that you purchase, things you put in your mouth, things that you buy for your home, your lifestyle, those things have a big impact on the oceans. The things you dispose of and how you dispose of it have a big impact on the oceans, and the energy and the way you consume energy. And I'll give you an example. So let's think about diet. Do you have seafood in your diet? Well, seafood and the fisheries industry is one of the biggest threats facing our oceans today. Are you being conscious about the choices you make when you eat seafood, or are you just buying whatever's in the can? There are sustainable options and there's very unsustainable options. And have you taken the time to become educated about what those choices are and how they impact both your health and the health of the oceans? A lot of folks haven't bothered doing that. And so we have a massive industry. It's worth close to $90 billion globally. And we are consuming fish at a rate that already in the last 50 years, we've lost 90% of the large fish in the oceans. And it's expected that by mid-century, most of global fisheries would have already collapsed or be in a state of collapse. So that's not a lot of time. And your decisions impact that. And it's not just whether you eat fish or not. If you think about, do you eat meat? 40% of the fish that comes out of the ocean goes into fish meal that's fed to livestock. So even if you don't eat fish, you're still eating fish, right? And do you eat salmon? Well, farmed salmon is fed live fish or fed ground up fish pellets that are caught from wild caught fish. And depending on the statistics, it takes somewhere between 4 to 9 pounds, depending on whose numbers you look at, of fish from the wild caught oceans to raise 1 pound of salmon. You might as well be eating the wild fish. And then you look at the shrimp industry, and whether it's raised in pens, which destroy global mangroves because of the toxic nature of how they raise them, or whether they're caught in the wild using trawlers that have 90% bycatch, which means for every shrimp you eat, 9 other things are being thrown back into the ocean. And so there's a lot of destructive fisheries out there, and each and every one of us has an opportunity to make a choice. When we sit down at a table and we choose to eat, we get to choose whether we're voting for the oceans with our palate or we're voting for our stomachs. And we can vote for both, but that requires a conscious choice. And the same is for disposal. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So I'm just wondering, so where do we do our homework if we're seafood eaters? Like, how do we decide if these shrimp are okay to eat or not? I mean, where would we even turn to learn more about this?
This is one of the biggest challenges because in the urgency to, quote, create sustainable fisheries, organizations and monitoring groups that were put in place, like the Marine Stewardship Council, and their job is to certify fisheries as sustainable. Well, the problem was they couldn't find just about any fishery that was sustainable. And so instead of pushing to change the standards within the fisheries, they started manipulating the standards within the actual standards body. So a lot of fisheries are now being certified as sustainable that in fact are incredibly destructive. And so it's probably the wild frontier right now. Monterey Bay has a seafood card that helps guide you. And there are some really positive choices in there. But currently it's about really doing your own research. And there's a lot of articles that you can find just with a quick Google search. Like if you Google search, why is shrimp bad for the environment? You will find incredible wealth of knowledge about how destructive the fisheries and farmed shrimp fisheries are for our planet. And at SeaLegacy, one of our jobs is to help support that information. And so if you look through our either SeaLegacy feed or one of Paul, mine, Andy's, or Mitty's feeds, you'll often see references and stories that focus on some of these destructive fisheries. But in the end, I mean, probably the simplest choice is if you don't know that that fish was caught by some person and not some large factory fleet, it's probably not sustainable. And there are hand-line fisheries, there are pole-in-line fisheries, there are highly managed fisheries up in Alaska. They're the exception, but do your homework and find out what they are if you really want to continue to eat seafood.
Okay, great. Thank you for that information. Now, I want to talk to you about your passion with manta rays and sharks. So can you tell me how that kind of became your focus?
It's interesting because my first exposure to sharks, I think, was very different than a lot of sort of the fairy tale versions. When I was young, I grew up in Durban, South Africa, and we had the Sharks Board, which was there to, quote, keep our beaches safe. And they put out shark nets every day along all the surf beaches. And unfortunately, what that really did was catch a bunch of vulnerable shark species and turtles and dolphins and whale sharks and other rays that were posing really no threat to people whatsoever. And in fact, most of them were heading out to sea when they got caught. And they would take them all in and they'd pile them in a freezer room. And every year our school would do a little trip down to the Sharks Board. And I remember when I was 6, standing in this giant freezer and just looking at these incredible animals, silky sharks and blue sharks and bronze whalers and tiger sharks. And while the other kids were gawking at how cool the teeth were and all that, I felt this incredibly deep sense of loss. Like, how could we be doing this to such beautiful animals? And it was sort of right then and there that I knew that I needed to do something to protect these oceans, but I didn't really have a starting point. And I also grew up along the wild coast of South Africa, where we had these massive migrations of sardines every year ripping up the coast, and hundreds of sharks, thousands of dolphins, and tens of thousands of Cape gannets would be pouring in on these huge shoals, and the entire ocean would erupt with life, literally bubble up on the beach. And behind it were humpback whales leaping into the surface. So I viewed the oceans as this incredible, vast bounty. And it was when I moved to America and I started to go with my family down to the Florida Keys, and I watched as this beautiful reef system collapsed and crumbled, turned into algae, all kinds of sediment washed over it. And one by one, the rays disappeared, the sharks disappeared. And I started to realize that in my very lifetime, I was watching the entire sunset on the oceans. And it sort of came back to sharks for me as a starting point, because there was a passion from my childhood. And I started digging into, well, what's happening to the apex predator? Because as I started to dive more, I never saw sharks. And in the storybooks, in the movies, you always saw shark-infested waters. And I was like, what happened to all the sharks? And what became a fascination turned into a sort of a global escapade around the world, just with a private camera in my little hand and my own research work. And I took myself undercover across coastlines from Latin America to Southeast Asia. And what I witnessed was a global genocide of proportions I could never imagine. In a single fishing port in Japan, we documented 7,500 sharks landed one day, in a single day, spewed out on this huge factory floor. And the first thing they went for all of them were their fins. And I was like, why are the fins valuable? And what I started noticing in shops in Chinatown and stuff were shark fin soup. And my research pretty much revealed that there was a growing demand, and this was almost 2 decades ago, that had spurred out of China with sort of the opening of China to the world with this sort of pullback of the Communist Party. And there was this dish called shark fin soup. And it was sort of only served to royalty, and it was extremely rare, hardly ever used. And there was this sort of gold rush to try to get onto like luxury items. And one of those things was dishes that were exquisite and unique, and shark fin soup was one of them. And what sort of resulted in that was this swatch, almost like a tidal wave of exploitation ripping across our oceans in the last 3 decades. It's resulted in the removal of 90 to 99% of most large oceanic shark species. Literally the obliteration of sharks. And it's now not just shark fin soup. What it then became other items, and leather for their skin, and oils that are used in makeup products, and even vaccines are using shark liver oil as an adjuvant or something to help you absorb it, and cartilage for shark cartilage pills. And basically we wound up turning the ocean's greatest predator, 400 million years of perfection and evolution, into fertilizer, makeup, and soup.
And so when you're bringing attention to this matter, I mean, a lot of people might say, well, sharks are scary. We're afraid of them anyway. It doesn't matter. Is that really, is there anything to that to be fearful of sharks?
Well, if you open your door and you immediately cower because of the possibility of a coconut hitting you on the head, or you never go outdoors or go for a walk because you think lightning's going to kill you, then maybe it does make sense. But you're far more likely to be killed by a coconut or lightning than to be ever killed by a shark. Across the world in a single year, on average, there's 5 deaths across the entire oceans per year from accidental shark bites. And that's with humans entering the water on average about 5 billion times. So that's about 5 billion potentials for interaction. And there's 5 deaths. So I don't know what 5 over 5 billion is, but I think that's pretty close to statistically zero. I think there's anything else on Earth is probably more likely than that to happen. And so it's incredibly rare. But on the other hand, sharks have everything to fear from us because we kill an estimated 100 million sharks every single year. That's 250,000 sharks a day, every single day, exploited for all the reasons I described above. And so we're literally driving a apex species to the family of species to the brink. And people are like, well, why does that matter? Well, sharks have evolved over 400 million years. They've survived 5 mass extinction events, much older than the dinosaurs. They were 73 million years ago. And so in their role as apex predators, they've held a delicate balance in our oceans through all of those extinction events. And they're perfectly adapted. They're slow to grow. They're slow to mature. They have very few young. And so when they grow into the sort of the food chain layer that they manage, it's almost impossible for them to overpopulate because they self-regulate their numbers. But it's the species they consume that are much faster growing. And so the tunas and other fish. And when you remove the sharks, what you have is this cascade level collapse where the next layer above it of fish explode. And then they consume everything underneath them. And it's almost like the table legs pop out and it drops. And then they drop. And so you have these sort of series of collapse that are happening in the ecosystem by removing the one species or family of species, sharks, that can keep the entire system in balance. And we've done already a lot of that. And we're really at the last tipping point. There's very little time. Some shark species, they estimate, will take many thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, if ever, to recover. And other ones, still like blue sharks and some other sharks, still have a chance. We're just still really, really slow on the uptake on conservation. And so why does that matter? Well, if you care about sustainable seafood or any seafood, if you care about the health of the oceans that support 2 billion people, 500 million jobs, well, if the system collapses, what happens when 2 billion people go hungry? If we look at what's happening in Syria and we look at sort of the refugee crises that are happening, well, what happens when now you have 2 billion people starving and they're displaced? You start to see issues in this global world, this pandemic that we just faced is a mere ripple compared to the tsunami of difficulty and struggle and pain that's going to cause.
Right. Yeah. And I think you mentioned in one of your Instagram posts about how much this affects the poorer communities. What are they going to have to eat? What are they going to have to fish? And it's really, important for many reasons, but that really struck me. I've been to Haiti quite a few times and working in villages. And the organization that I'm with, they are trying to teach the people how to fish. And it's difficult because they have to actually go out further than you would think to try to get fish.
So I did weeks of work in these coastal communities in Haiti. And it's funny. It's not funny. It's actually really sad. They have a little bit of fuel sometimes to get them out, but then they have to sort of tack in with their sails to get back. And they actually have little coal pots that they actually cook with on the boats because they have nothing else. That's all they got, right? And their children are eating mud pancakes for breakfast to keep their stomachs full because they have no food. And it was several decades ago that the government wholesaled their fisheries to commercial fleets from Europe and America that came in, and Asia, that came in and long lined, which means you put out, miles and miles of this long line, and each segment has hooks laying off. So you have thousands of hooks, and you catch everything from sharks to turtles to rays and all the fish. And they cleaned out a lot of their primary fisheries, and they left nothing for the coastal communities. And so I was on one beach where they were using like almost screens from windows, nets with such small meshes, and they would scrape it across the entire shoreline, and they would come up with a few minnows. And that's all they had to eat.
Yeah.
And so for a place like Haiti, we want to teach them to fish, but there's very little fish left. And so really they need recovery there, and they need sort of much more regenerative approach. But a lot of people aren't interested in that because that takes time, that takes effort, it takes discipline, and people are looking for quick fixes. And with the oceans and other ecosystem-based issues, there are no quick fixes.
Right. And the manta ray, how did you come to love the manta ray so much?
Manta rays are almost mythical creatures. Anyone who's had the incredible opportunity to dip into the ocean and come face to face and spend time in the company of one of these animals is forever transformed. They're these giant creatures. People think like manta ray, and they're like, oh, like 5 feet across. No, they get up to 25 feet across. And the average one maybe is in Hawaii, maybe is 10 to 15 feet. And in the giant, the giant Pacific ones can get up to 20, 22 feet. And they're highly intelligent animals. They have the largest brain to body mass ratio of any shark or ray. In fact, their brains look very akin to ours, dual lobed, highly foliated, and they're very sophisticated. They're intelligent. They're highly social. And for most part, they act more like mammals. They are a fish, but they act a lot like mammals. And so when you encounter one of these beautiful creatures, you might be on a reef or swimming in the blue. And for me, it was in Thailand, probably more than 2 decades ago. And I just drifted off this dive site that we tried to drop on in the strong currents. And I was trying to kick back, and then suddenly this giant alien dark form came out of the reef and came right at me. And I was like, whoa, what is that? It was about 15 feet across. So this giant, giant wingspan, and came right at me. And I realized, oh my God, that's a manta ray. And it swooped right in, put its belly, flashed its belly to me, and then started to swim around me. And each time it came right at eye level, and it made eye contact. And then it started doing loops over me. And I was with my dive buddy, and for 45 minutes, we drifted in the blue with this incredible creature that just kept looping around us. And it would swim back to my dive buddy, circle, loop around him, turn around, come back to me. And eventually we ran out of air, right? And we're like, we got to leave. And it was very clear that this animal didn't want us to leave. And so we would start swimming up, and it would almost block us. And we're like, no, we got to go. And I remember I sort of kicked up to the surface, and it stopped and was swimming around underneath me. And then I had these silvery fins, and I went with my fins, and it turned, and it came, oh, you want to play? And it came right back up to me again. And it looked at me, and I was like, and I sort of waved goodbye, and it's like, and it turned, sort of drifted off, turned one more time, wiggled its wings, and I was like, can't come. And then it drifted off and disappeared in the blue.
Oh, that's so cool.
What other wild animal, right?
Yeah.
Would do so much. I've been in the world with whales and dolphins. They're incredible. And a dolphin might come and play with you for a few minutes if you're lucky. A whale will give you a swim by if you're lucky. But nothing else will ever come and play with you for 45 minutes. It's probably one of the most socially sophisticated animals on Earth or in the water I've ever experienced. And so for me, I fell in love with this creature. I fell in love with what it represented. It's sort of, I call it a ray of hope. It's sort of like there is hope for humanity if we can allow ourselves to connect with animals to really bridge that species difference. Because we barely manage to do it with our race differences on Earth, right? But if we can even get it down to the species level, we can open up entirely new channels within us, and we can form those connections that open those empathy centers and really inspire us, not from a need for wealth or accumulation of, goods or power, but just because it's the right thing to do and it feels good to protect these animals. And that's what manta rays represent to me.
Yeah, they're really cool. I've never seen a manta ray face to face, but we'll swim sometimes with the smaller rays, like the is it the eagle ray that's spotted?
Yes.
And the smaller rays, and I don't know. I think there's something very spiritual about them, and they're so inquisitive, and we're never worried or fearful when they're nearby. We're just more like, oh my gosh, they're so cool.
They're
So,
they're like alien angels, just drifting in the blue. They're here to remind us that there's intelligence, there's connection beyond things we currently understand, and that we better hold some space for it and not obliterate these sacred places before we get a chance to really experience them.
yeah. Well, tell me about your art. So, you said that art is my passion, conservation is my purpose, and for me, the two are inseparable. So I know that your photography, in looking at it, is very artistic. And so, how did you combine your passion for both conservation and art to create so many of your beautiful images?
Very difficultly. It's an interesting question, and it's one that it's not just a statement, it's something that I wrestled with for almost 2 decades. I want to make change in the world. I want to protect these animals. I want to ensure that we have healthy and abundant oceans and that our rainforests thrive and that all the creatures, all these beautiful sentient beings get to have a home just like we do. And so that really drives me as like what I was put on this earth to do. I wake up every single day knowing that's my purpose. And it's just laser focused. But at the same time, ever since I was a small child, I've been fascinated by light. I've been drawn to art. When other kids were getting trucks and guns for toy guns, I was getting art coloring books and making clay and metal sculptures. And it was always that part of me that really loved the idea of creating something from one element and transforming it into another form of expression. And it was when I finally picked up a camera that I realized, wow, here's a tool that I can express with, and I can tell stories with, and I can inspire emotions and feelings, and I can get people to react. Mm-hmm. And I think like all people who get into photography and then ultimately into filmmaking, you sort of move through different layers of your art. And I think the first layer was just capture what I saw, right? Whoa, what a beautiful sunset, or what a beautiful animal, right? And that's sort of the literal translation, right? And then over time, it's like, well, I need to do more, because when I show someone that image, they're not reacting the way I felt, and I want to get them to that point. And so then there's sort of the experiential layer. And for me, that's where it's like, whoa, what was it like? What was the energy in that moment? When that ray came up to you, what was the light and all that? And so you start working with composition and light and shadow and shading and things like that to try to really bring that out. And then the ultimate expression is, what did I feel? Now we're into fully abstract land, right? Mm-hmm. It's no longer any literal translation. It's just, was I joyous? Did I feel some sense of responsibility, sadness, inspiration in a very unique, specific context? Mm-hmm. And then how can I get my imagery and my films to draw that out? And I call that sort of the surreal. It's still real, but it's surreal. And so my work really ultimately became that, which was incredible light rays exploding, like for this picture you see right behind me, right? Mm-hmm. Almost unimaginable that really happened, but it did. And so my art has taken me sort of on quest to really represent these species in these places in their ultimate, in the most surreal form, so that when someone looks at that image, they go deep into it and they spend time on it. They navigate through the space of complexity and composition and light. And rather than thinking about it, I try to keep it really simple. I want it to go straight past their thinking center and right into their emotional base, their foundation. And I want them to feel immediately the vulnerability of these animals, but also a sense of responsibility and inspiration to take action in their defense. And so it's sort of like it's a mind hack almost, right? How can I move very quickly from indifference to absolute deep engagement and inspiration?
And I think you capture that definitely with the light. And then the models, are the models actually there in those images? Or they imposed, is it superimposed? I don't know.
So many people are like, that's not real, right? And I'm like, it's real.
Yeah.
And one aspect of my work, it's interesting, like given a choice, I just love to spend time with these animals. And, the vast majority of my filmmaking is really sort of community, artisanal, natural history. But there's a layer of my work that I like to sort of go into the connection series, is what I call it in my art practice. And that's about connecting humans to these systems in ways that people wouldn't really imagine possible, and stripping away all the scuba gear and all the tech stuff to make it really accessible and almost storybook, so that when you see that man or woman sort of connecting and not juxtaposed, because a lot of people are like, let's get someone with a shark. No, it's like connection.
Mm-hmm.
What I want you to do is experience the vulnerability of that person, and also the awe and the magnificence of that moment that you see in the image, and try to then relate that to yourself on one layer. But also, because there's that human vulnerability and connection happening, you see that also within the species they're connecting to.
Mm-hmm.
So you start to almost bring that human aspect or quality to these species that we largely know nothing about from a sort of mind level, from an emotional level. And at least now you can empathize with them through the connection you're seeing in that human subject. And so
Yeah.
that makes it accessible to kids in inner cities, to people who are much more interested in fashion and pop art and culture. It opens up an entirely different non-natural history audience that now starts to get engaged and interested in the oceans.
Yeah. Yes. There's one image of, I think it's maybe a whale shark or a whale, and that you have with the woman, and they're both kind of looking up, or in almost
Yeah.
the same position. And you're
Yes.
talking about how I want people to look at it and analyze it. And that was one where I just was like in awe. And really, I was looking at the lighting, I was looking at the connection. There was so much I was thinking about, and you just really, all of your work is beautiful, but that was something that really struck me, that one photo in particular.
Yeah, that one's one of the ones that's really special. And it's sort of aspirational level work that I go for. And so there's only a handful ever that make it into that super high artist collection category. And but it also comes down to who you're working with. And the image you're talking about, that's a woman, a professional underwater performer and activist, Hannah Mermaid. And she's the best underwater performer I've ever seen in the world, who has literally put her life on the line on numerous occasions to stand in defense of ocean animals, whether it be dolphins in Taiji or manta rays or sharks. And so what you're seeing in that image is not only just it's not a model, it's a real person
Mm-hmm.
who has a real connection, who's standing in real defense of these real beings. And so the
Right.
authenticity of that connection and that moment makes it leaves an indelible mark in your soul. Like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
that's real.
It's really cool. Well, I want to transition into cinematography and racing Extinction. I just have so many questions, but I know we can only briefly touch on that. It looked like I would be very scared to be in your position. And if anybody hasn't seen this, they need to check it out. But it was very cool, very eye-opening, but also something, like I said, I feel like, was there any fear, or were you just so passionate about making this happen that kind of moved you through the whole process of filming this?
Sometimes ignorance works in your advantage. And I think, honestly, my passion to do the work, and what you're referring to is this very deep undercover investigative storytelling work into the illicit and often illegal wildlife trade. And we went all over the world. We were in China, in South America, and Southeast Asia, going into some of the scariest sort of mafia and triad driven operations to expose the level of exploitation. And yeah, it's dangerous. I've had knives held at my throat. I've been chased out of towns with machetes and guns. I've been shot at. I've had military with, hit orders on me. A lot of really heavy stuff. And I didn't do it for adrenaline. I think it was my absolute sense of purpose combined with almost a force field that was granted to me by allowing that absolute unwavering commitment to allow me to become whatever character I needed to become. And, you take on a false identity, whether you're going to be a fisherman or a seafood trader or a tourist or a culinary tour, or you name it, right? And you become that role. You often hear about actors, and they take on a persona, and sometimes they go so deep they have to almost peel themselves out of it, and it gets really hard. That's what I had to do. And I think the hardest part of that was taking on personas of the very people that were doing some of the most horrific things you can imagine to species, and pretending to be that person. And that was a bit soul blackening, because not only are you witnessing sort of massive levels of horrific crimes against nature, but you're acting as if you're complicit in it. And that's a very dark thing, and it's dangerous land to walk. And outside of the physical danger, there was a lot of post-traumatic stress and, real deep trauma that resulted from that I've had to do a lot of work on, honestly. I'm not Superman. I'm a highly empathetic person that's doing this work because I feel deeply for these places and these species. And that really, really cut at me. And, I've had to really dial it in recent years, measure that kind of work out, because when you spend a decade diligently pursuing that dark work, the darkness can consume you. And so I balance that with the light. And so I have my fine art practice has a light room series and a dark room series. And it's the juxtaposition of some of those really dark elements with the ultimate beautiful, magnificent representation of these animals in their full majesty.
Mm-hmm. And Tales by Light, I haven't seen that. That's the title of the Netflix series, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? And is that something that we can still check out?
Yeah, it's up. It's a very popular series on Netflix. There's a team that I worked with out of Australia called Untitled Productions, and Abe Jaffe is an amazing director-producer. And they produced, in partnership with Canon, a 3-year series. And each year they focused on, I think it's 3 photographers or media makers that were using their cameras as tools for construction, basically tools to heal. And some of them were working in social and cultural issues, and others in environmental issues. And in series 3, they asked if I would be willing to be featured. And I'm very selective on these things because I'm very focused on my work, and TV can be very distracting. But they absolutely assured me that I'd be able to tell a very real conservation story. And so it was really fun. We got to go to Mexico, where I worked with the whale sharks, and then we got to go to Raja Ampat, which is in far eastern Indonesia, and in an area where we've worked in partnership with this group called Masul Resort, to protect a massive swatch, 1,200 square kilometers of absolute no-take zone. And we've seen recovery of 300% biomass and upwards of 500% in some places, and 25 times more sharks now in the protected zone than outside of it. And, a half a dozen to a dozen turtles now, roaming and feeding in these lagoons when once there were none, they'd all been taken. And so it's the story of how we went into these places and inspired the communities to take ownership of their future and protect their land, their birthrights, their ocean birthrights. And imagery played a really big part of that, because we took the stories of the oceans back to the governments and back to the communities to inspire them to understand how precious their natural resources are, how vulnerable they are, the exploitation that was happening to them, and how if they protected them, they could assure the sanctity of their birthright and also the incomes from their fisheries and all that long into the future. And so the story for Tales by Light was how I had collaborated with these communities and these operators to help facilitate those outcomes, using that camera, using that video and storytelling to drive those stories home.
Oh, that's awesome. I can't wait to check it out. So season 3.
Season 3, I think I'm episodes 3 and 4. It's on Netflix. Just look up Tales by Light.
Okay, great. Well, I have a couple more questions to wrap it up. So my next question is, in all of your work, what, I'm sure there are many things that you are proud of, but if you could think of one thing, what are you most proud of in your career thus far?
Wow. I think I've been really blessed to have worked on some really important issues with an incredible team. And I emphasize team because we often see sort of the imagery and the story at the front of it, and we ascribe ownership entirely to that. And the truth is, it takes a village to raise and solve these issues. And I have my SeaLegacy team. I have my co-founders Paul and Christina. I have my coworker, John Weller and Candace, and an entire network of people that are both domestic and international that I've been able to work with to achieve some incredible outcomes. I think one of the ones that was probably the most moving was the one in Racing Extinction, which was when we got manta rays that have been massively exploited by Chinese medicine for their gill plates for some pseudo-medicinal tonic that was leading literally to the collapse of their populations around the world. And we got to bring that story to the national, international stage. And there's a United Nations body called CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and Wild Fauna. And it's the only international body that has binding provisions in the treaty to require member nations to adhere to these rulings. And in 2013, after a 5-year massive effort, we brought them to the stage, and on a nail-biting vote, 184 nations voted to protect these manta rays. Oh. And I just remember, I leapt out of my chair. I was at the meeting. My fist went in the air. I hugged my colleague, Mary, and just tears were pouring down my eyes because I realized, in the face of, almost insurmountable odds, in the, combating greed and apathy and ignorance and just unchecked exploitation, we proved that by connecting people to these animals and inspiring them, that somewhere in these policymakers' hearts, we planted a seed, and that sprung up and grew into a decision to change the future of these incredibly, incredibly important species forever. And that really was transformative in my career.
Yeah, that's amazing. That is an incredible moment, I'm sure, and was an incredible moment. So what can we do as the Pearl Jam community? Tomorrow's Earth Day. If we want to do something tomorrow, what can we do? And also, how can we support SeaLegacy?
Well, I think there's a number of things you can do, in terms of organization. We have something called the Tide. And, whatever level you want to contribute at, there's all kinds of levels that are accessible to all kinds of people. But become active. And if you join the Tide, you start to learn about these issues, right? And you can engage with these issues, and you can become a part of solving these issues. And sometimes it's by driving petitions or helping shape policy with your voice. Other times it's a contribution, smaller or whatever you want to make. And so joining the Tide is an incredible thing to do. Another step is we've launched a global platform called Only.one, Only One. So just go to Only.one. And there's an amazing depth of stories in there, harnessing not just our storytellers, but other storytellers from around the world. We have over 50-something organizations that are already partnered on this to bring ocean issues, 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the oceans, changing how we fish, to protecting species, to addressing climate issues. All of those things are addressed in these beautiful, vibrant, inspiring story tracks that all lead to action. And I think those are an incredible starting point. And then I think on an individual level, maybe tomorrow, think about eating less fish, less animals, and a bit more plant-based. Think about reducing our pressure on these beings that are being exploited, because just by doing that one step, could you imagine if billions of people ate more and more plants and less animals and fish? We'd make a much more positive impact on the planet. And so there's a couple things that people could do tomorrow.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your great work with us and how we can, do more for our amazing Earth and taking care of our oceans. And if you guys want to check out Shawn, he has an awesome Instagram page with many stories to tell and a lot of things that will better educate you about certain issues. And you can also follow SeaLegacy on Instagram if you aren't already. So thanks again, Shawn, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you so much, and thank you for supporting our work. Really appreciate it.
Of course.